In this series on discipleship, we saw the invitation to discipleship, the disciples' identity, and last week we began with the disciples' instruction. We want to continue that train of thought, the disciples' instruction. Jesus, in this passage, continuing with his teaching or instructions to the disciple, he now moves into the area of praying for divine assistance when living out our faith in community. As oddly as this may sound, we, his disciples, those who are saved, those who are sanctified, those who are baptized, Holy Ghost filled, some with fire, others with tongues, we cannot live up to the commands given to us by Jesus without divine assistance. We need the help of heaven. We need heaven's help if we are to have our lives come into alignment with the commands given to us by Jesus. Simply put, we can't do this on our own. We don't have the capacity to do it on our own. And our text in Matthew 7, beginning with verse 7, this, interestingly, it follows the teaching as it has been titled the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus shared some precepts for living in that Sermon on the Mount. He shared some precepts for living that were radical to the practices of the religious culture and community of that day. There was some radical teaching going on in this Sermon on the Mount. And so when you back up 2 chapters, beginning at chapter 5, we note that Jesus laid upon these followers some instructions that were profoundly different from what they had grown accustomed to practice in their faith. So in his teaching, he says to them that they were blessed. Again in chapter 5, the Beatitudes. They should have a beatitude attitude. They were blessed when they hungered and thirsted. That's radically different. He said they were blessed when they mourned, that they were blessed when they were persecuted. He challenged them in the Beatitudes to embrace their identity as salt of the earth and as light of the world. As well as he was teaching them to be willing to suffer wrong without retaliation. Are you listening to me? I said his teaching was radical because he told them you ought to love your enemies. And he told them this is how you pray. And he gives us the model prayer, which we've called the Lord's Prayer, but it's really the model prayer. He told them this is how you should pray. He told them to fast in a manner that was pleasing to God. He taught them, if you go back and read it, he said, this is where you ought to store your treasure, where moth and thieves and rust did not corrupt it or steal it. He said to them, don't be concerned about worldly possessions. Don't try to get a whole lot of stuff in this life, because the value of life is not measured by your net worth. And then last week we saw where he was teaching them not to be judgmental. Don't judge people. Don't try to get straw and splinters out of someone else's eye when you have, a beam, a log in your own eye. And so, as he's speaking to this multitude on the hillside, giving them some radical instructions for living, upon hearing this weighty teaching, these instructions were very different. They were very different from the life that they had grown accustomed to living. And so the disciples, those who were under the sound of his voice, were undoubtedly wondering how in the world could anyone live up to what he was instructing them to do. I mean, this loving my enemy business and being blessed when I'm mourning and blessed when I'm persecuted and, not to worry about stuff. How in the world can anyone live up to what he was instructing? Recognizing the spiritual and mental dilemma that he had caused, Jesus does not leave his disciples without hope. As they were obviously looking at themselves, knowing that they did not have the capacity nor the constitution to rise to such a lofty life of faith, I can only imagine the dismay that was written all over their faces. So before they bowed out and before they resigned their commitment to follow, Jesus gives them the key to their victory over the seemingly impossible life to be lived as one of his disciples. Now remember, he had already laid out the model prayer. Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That prayer was laid out. It's recorded in chapter 6. And so in this passage of chapter 7, beginning with verse 7, he returns to the discipline of prayer and puts forth some specifics as to how to get answers from God for the questions, for the challenges, and for the difficulties faced when trying to live up to the life that he was calling them to. For certain, Jesus did not want his disciples praying amiss. He did not want them praying erroneously, or he definitely did not want them not praying at all. But rather, he wanted them to pray fervently and with accuracy as it relates to what they could expect to receive from God the Father through the discipline of prayer. So right there in verse 7, he's looking at their faces. He said, let me help you before you all quit. He says, ask and it shall be given. Seek, ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be open unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be open.